The midwife's hands were slick with blood as she worked desperately to save the life of the 13-year-old girl writhing in agony on the bed. For hours the child, because that's what she was, a child, had been screaming as her underdeveloped body tried to do what it was never meant to do at such a young age. The baby was stuck. The mother was dying. And in that moment, as death hovered over Pembroke Castle in the winter of 1457, everyone in that room knew the truth that history would try to forget. Margaret Beaufort should never have been pregnant in the first place. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to tell you the story that medieval historians have sanitized for centuries. The horrifying reality of what happened when a 12-year-old girl was forced into marriage with a man twice her age who refused to wait. This isn't just another of medieval marriage customs. This is the story of how one man's greed permanently destroyed a child's body. How the most powerful people in England stood by and let it happen. And how that traumatized little girl would grow up to become the most formidable woman in Tudor England. What you're about to hear comes directly from contemporary accounts, medical records, and the shocking confession made by Margaret's own priest after her death. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Margaret Beaufort's story wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern so horrific that even by medieval standards, people knew it was wrong. Yet, they did it anyway. Picture this. May 31st, 1443. A baby girl is born at Bleo Castle in Bedfordshire. Her name is Margaret, and from the moment she draws her first breath, she's not a child. She's a commodity. Her father, John Bowett, is the Duke of Somerset, one of the most powerful men in England. But within a year of Margaret's birth, something happens that will seal her fate. Her father is found dead under mysterious circumstances. The whispers spread quickly through the castle halls. Suicide. In medieval England, taking your own life wasn't just a sin. It was a disgrace that tainted your entire family. And suddenly, baby Margaret isn't just an AIS. She's vulnerable. Prey. By the time Margaret could barely walk, the vultures were already circling. You see, this one-year-old baby had just inherited a fortune that would make grown men salivate. Land, titles, wealth, all wrapped up in a package small enough to fit in a cradle. Her mother, Margaret Beaufort, tried to protect her daughter, keeping her close, raising her alongside her half-siblings in what should have been a safe, loving environment. She even made sure little Margaret received an exceptional education, teaching her to read French, encouraging her sharp intelligence. For a brief moment, you might think this story could have a different ending, but King Henry VI had other plans. When Margaret was just 3 years old, the king handed her over like a prize to William Depole, the Duke of Suffolk. The Duke immediately did what any predator would do. He married this toddler to his 7-year-old son, John, a 3-year-old bride. Let that sink in. She probably couldn't even properly pronounce the words of the ceremony, if she spoke at all. The wedding likely took place between January and February 1450, though some records suggest an earlier date. They needed papal dispensation because the children were related, which the Pope granted in August 1450. Even the church was complicit. But Suffolk's plan backfired spectacularly. By 1453, he'd been arrested and murdered, his political star fallen, and suddenly little Margaret was back on the market. That's when King Henry VI made a decision that would destroy her life. He gave her to the Tudor brothers. Edmund and Jasper Tudor were the king's half-brothers, born from his mother's scandalous second marriage to a Welsh servant named Owen Tudor. They were ambitious, they were ruthless, and they had the king's ear. When Edmund Tudor looked at 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort, he didn't see a child who still played with dolls. He saw a fortune. He saw a womb. He saw his future. The wedding took place on November 1st, 1455. Margaret was 12, Edmund was 24. Now I need you to understand something crucial here. Even in medieval England, where child marriages were common, there was an unspoken rule. You didn't consummate the marriage until the girl was at least 14, preferably older. It wasn't out of kindness. It was practicality. They knew that pregnancy and childbirth could kill young girls. They'd seen it happen. Even without modern medical knowledge, they understood that a 12-year-old's body wasn't ready. Edmund Tudor didn't care. Within days of the wedding, Possibly on the wedding night itself, this 24-year-old man sexually assaulted a 12-year-old child. I'm not using that word for shock value. I'm using it because that's what it was. Margaret couldn't legally consent. She couldn't emotionally consent. Her body wasn't physically developed enough for what happened to her. Noble families routinely negotiated contracts that specifically forbade consummation until the bride was older. The fact that Edmund Tudor ignored these conventions, that he chose to impregnate a 12-year-old for financial gain, was shocking even to his contemporaries. But they let it happen anyway because Margaret wasn't really a person to them. She was property. Property that could be traded, sold, and used as her owners saw fit. The king who gave her to Edmund, the nobles who witnessed the wedding, the priests who blessed the union. They all knew what would happen to her, and they did nothing. This is the system that created the Tudor dynasty. This is the suffering that put Henry VII on the throne. Every Tudor monarch who followed, Henry VIII with his 6 wives, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, They all trace their lineage back to a 13-year-old girl who nearly died giving birth because a grown man couldn't wait 2 more years to secure his fortune. Margaret Beaufort survived. She even thrived in her way. She founded colleges. At Cambridge, Christ College and St. John's College still honor her as their foundress. She became a patron of education, a political powerhouse, a woman who signed herself Margaret R., as if she were a queen in her own right. But success doesn't erase trauma. Achievement doesn't undo damage. When she died on June 29, 159, just 5 days after her 66th birthday, Margaret Beaufort had outlived 4 husbands, seen her son become king, and her grandson, Henry VII, inherit the throne. She'd accumulated vast wealth and power. She'd shaped the course of English history, but she'd never had another child. Her body never recovered from what Edmund Tudor did to her when she was 12 years old. This is the part of the story that gets lost in the glamour of Tudor history. We talk about Henry VII's wives, about Elizabeth I's golden age, about the Tudor rose and the break with Rome. We don't talk about the child bride whose suffering made it all possible. We don't talk about how the Tudor dynasty was built on the broken body of a 13-year-old girl. But Margaret's story is still relevant today. In a world where child marriage still exists, where young girls are still traded like property, where their bodies are still seen as commodities to be exploited, Margaret Beaufort stands as a reminder of what happens when we fail to protect children. She survived. Yes, she even conquered. But at what cost? The midwife who delivered Henry Tudor that day in Pembroke Castle probably went home thinking she'd witnessed a miracle. And in a way she had. It was a miracle that Margaret survived. It was a miracle that Henry survived. But it was a preventable miracle, one that should never have been necessary if the adults in Margaret's life had done their job and protected her. Instead, they sacrificed her childhood, her body, and her future children on the altar of political ambition. She deserves to have her story told in full, not just the powerful woman she became, but the brutalized child she was. Because until we acknowledge the real cost of power, until we face the human suffering behind the grand narratives of history, we're doomed to repeat the same cruelties. Margaret couldn't save her granddaughter. She couldn't undo what was done to her. But maybe by telling her story honestly, by refusing to look away from the horror of it, we can at least honor her memory. The real Margaret Beaufort, the child who survived the unsurvivable, the girl who built a dynasty on the ruins of her own body. She was 12 years old. He was 24. It was wrong then. It's wrong now. And all the Tudor roses in the world can't make it right. Every time you see a portrait of Henry VIII, remember that he existed because a 12-year-old girl was sexually assaulted. Every time you read about Elizabeth, remember that her dynasty was founded on child abuse. Every time someone romanticizes Tudor England, remember Margaret Beaufort, 13 years old, screaming in agony as her child body tried to give birth to the future. That's the price of power. That's the cost of dynasty. That's the truth behind the Tudor rose. It bloomed in blood, watered with the tears of a child who should have been playing with dolls, not delivering kings. Margaret Beaufort died believing it was God's will. She died having internalized the violence done to her as divine providence. She died never knowing that she deserved better, that she had always deserved better, that every little girl deserves better than to be sacrificed for someone else's ambition. But we know better now. We know that 12-year-olds can't consent. We know that child marriage is abuse. We know that what Edmund Tudor did was wrong, no matter what century it happened in. And we know that Margaret Beaufort was more than just the mother of the Tudor dynasty. She was a survivor of child sexual abuse who spent her life trying to protect others from her fate. She couldn't protect her granddaughter. She couldn't protect the countless other girls who suffered as she did. But maybe by remembering her story, by telling it truly, we can protect the girls who come after. Maybe that can be Margaret Beaufort's real legacy, not colleges or dynasties or political power, but the truth of what happens when we fail to protect our children. She was 12 years old. Never forget that. In all the glory of Tudor history, in all the pageantry and power, never forget that it started with a 12-year-old girl who nearly died, because the adults who should have protected her chose profit over her life instead. That's the horror at the heart of the Tudor rose. That's the blood that stained the throne. That's the price Margaret Beaufort paid for a dynasty she never asked to create. She was 12 years old, and that should have been enough to save her.